It's certainly a pleasure to be with you tonight and to talk on this subject of self-control as one of the fruits of the Spirit. Self-control is certainly a biblical idea, a part of Christianity, a word that equates to self-control in Greek, occurs 5 times in the Greek New Testament. It occurs in Acts 24 when Paul is preaching to Festus, the Roman governor, and his wife Drusilla, and he gets to a certain point and they don't want to hear anymore. And they say, we'll wait till a more convenient time. And one of the things he's talking about there, the scripture says, is self-control. And then it occurs in the passage that is the basis of this series in Galatians 5 as part of the fruit of the Spirit. And it occurs in Titus chapter 1 as one of the qualifications of an elder. And it occurs in 2 Peter chapter 1 in that famous passage that says, add to your faith virtue or excellence, and to your virtue self-control. And it occurs a 5th time in 1 Corinthians 9 when Paul uses the metaphor of athletics to talk about the nature of the Christian life. And I would like to read that passage, and because I think that it provides an insight into the practical meaning of self-control in our lives. And I'm translating it myself, so I, to the extent that I'm varying from standard translations, I'll try to explain it and why. Don't you know that everyone who runs in a race runs, but one receives the prize? So run in order that you may fully receive it. Right? The word, when he says one receives the prize, this is an intensive of that word. Paul is making the point, run not just so that you will get the prize, but that you'll really get it, you'll possess it. Everyone who competes exercises self-control in every respect. They, in order that they might receive a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible one. Therefore I run not as uncertainly. I fight, I box, as not beating the air. But and it's literally in Greek something like, I beat my body, right? I beat myself black and blue, and I bring my body under subjection, lest, having preached to others, I myself might become unworthy. The medieval Catholic Church, in trying to make people think about common morality, said that there were 7 cardinal virtues. And the word cardinal there comes from the word in Latin for hinge. And they meant 7 pivotal virtues, 7 virtues on which other virtues turn and depend. And one of the virtues that is included in that 7 is temperance. In other words, self-control. And they're claiming, in other words, that self-control isn't just part of Christianity, it's a fundamental part of Christianity. And the basic reason why I believe that they had that right, and by the way, they were following a pattern that goes back before Revelation, right? The Greek philosophers taught the same thing. But the basic reason why it's fundamental is just this. I use this explanation to my students when I teach it in our values course, that is a capstone course that all our seniors have to take. You can't give God something that you don't have. Right? I grew up in a small town in Appalachia, and my first job was in a small town bank. Boy, it was a great job. It didn't pay much of anything, but it was a great job because in small town banks in the 1960s, they were full of women, and the president, the person who actually ran the bank was a woman, but in the culture of that time, you couldn't have a woman as president of the bank, and so we had this worthless guy who was president, but I'm there as, working as a peon, and all those women mothered me. It was a great job. But anyway, we had a lady in town who every year wrote a check to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. And I think that it was for $20. That's my best recollection. The only problem was that she didn't have $20. And so, small town banking being what it was 50 years ago, we didn't charge her anything, but on the other hand, we did make a contribution to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. The check bounced. You can't write moral checks from an empty account, right? You can't give God what you don't have. And what does God want you to have? Think about the implications of Paul's metaphor there and his personal application of it to himself. Of what does Christianity consist? I believe it consists of trying to be like Jesus of Nazareth, not agreeing with him, right, and not even obeying him, but becoming like him, being transformed, being born again. People use that metaphor, and being born again without having a new life is meaningless. Right? God wants us to be so much more than we would be without his grace. You think of the famous passage in 1 Peter chapter 2. Right? You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, an elect nation, a people for God's possession, so that you might show forth the excellencies of the one who called you out of darkness into marvelous light. Our assignment from God is to be the kind of people that when other people look at us, they understand and love God more. Now that sounds to me like something that isn't easily done, right? That calls from us the greatest effort that we can possibly make. Not that we can do it on our own. It isn't work salvation, right? The question isn't who we can make ourselves be. The question is, what can we be with God's grace? And if we satisfy ourselves with something less than that, right, that ought to cause us great sorrow. Not just, but it isn't a question just of worrying that I'm going to miss heaven. If I love God and Christ, don't I want to be as pleasing to him and as useful for him as I can be? If I love my fellow human beings, don't I want to strip away from my life anything that lessens my ability to reach them? Now, Paul says, about himself, it's no longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. Think about that man saying, I still, and it's almost a funny word in Greek. I beat myself, right? In another place, Paul says that he sees this warfare in his members. That person who wants to surrender his life completely to Christ, having the mind of Christ, and having the mind of Christ means not just coming to the same conclusions, but thinking the same way as Christ thinks, feeling the same emotions as Christ feels. That person is still fighting, struggling to be a better person. Now, the metaphor that Paul uses there has been very meaningful to me on a personal level for several years. About 12 years ago, I was teaching in Italy, and in a small town, and there wasn't much way to get any exercise except running. And so I started running. I discovered I liked it pretty well. And I ran for a long time. I ran marathon distance several times, but I never entered a formal marathon for the next couple of years. And then in 2010, I ran my first marathon was a fiasco because they had this big thunderstorm and they called it off right as I was showing up. They put the barrier. I almost ran into it so that I couldn't finish the thing. And that wasn't very encouraging. But the next marathon I ran, I discovered I could run pretty well. I qualified for the Boston Marathon, which only about 10% of marathon runners are ever able to do. And okay, that's great. I enjoyed it. And I ran several more marathons. And then I asked myself, what if you really prepared for a marathon? Now, I've been running 40 or 50 miles a week to prepare for the marathons that I ran. But what if I ran as much as champion marathon runners run? What could I do? And I discovered that I could run a lot faster. The difference in absolute terms may not seem like much, but the difference of running a minute faster each mile, so 26 minutes faster for the entire race, is the difference between being in the top 10% of runners and being in the top 1/10 of 1% of runners. And I was able to run in the Boston Marathon and race the Boston Marathon instead of just run it. And one of my nicer memories in my comical athletic career, I was very unathletic as a kid, and I just loved the fact that my brothers, who were very athletic, had to listen to me talk about the Boston Marathon. But I was once mountain climbing with a gal from England who talked about the marathon wall. I don't know whether any of you are runners, but people talk about the marathon wall at mile 18 or 19. And I told her the marathon wall is what you hit when you're not prepared to run a marathon. Right? When somebody is genuinely prepared to race a marathon, when they get to mile 18, they don't say, oh no, they say, hot dog. Right? Time to run. And one of my most pleasant memories is getting to mile 19 in the Boston Marathon, so-called Heartbreak Hill, and over those last 7 miles passing literally thousands of my fellow runners because I was prepared and they were not. Now, if I showed you pictures of runners to illustrate Paul's point, that would, I've cured in the 55 years that I've preached, I've cured the insomnia of thousands. But if I showed you pictures of runners, that would really do the trick. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you some pictures of mountain climbing, which is my other hobby. That's me, hopefully not from the best angle. But I'm climbing what is a mountain climber would call the crux of the Arête du Cosmique, a well-known climbing spot in the French Alps, just to the northwest of Mont Blanc. And the crux is the most difficult part, right? When you start to climb a mountain, you need to consider whether or not you're going to be able to get through the most difficult part, because you don't want to be up at 21,000 feet and decide, whoops, I can't do this. Right? Once in Bolivia, I had almost that happen to me. I was climbing the second highest mountain in Bolivia named Iamani, and there's a place where you jump across a crevasse and you can't land on your feet on the other side. You have to play Spider-Man and dig into the ice. You have little spikes on your shoes, on the fronts of your shoes, and you stick those in. And given that I'm not exactly a brute in terms of upper body strength, I bounced off a couple of times before finally being able to do that. All right, the crux, though, is an important thing for us to think about. Right? What should I be working on in my life? It's something I learned in business. You have a manufacturing or mining process. I was in the mining industry. And how do you improve that process? Well, the thing you do is you look at what you think is the limiting factor, the bottleneck, the thing that's keeping you from being more productive overall. Shouldn't a Christian ask himself or herself the same kind of question? What is it that's keeping me from being a better and more useful servant for God? And work on that. It's easy I tell my students, right, if I, in business, if I gave those who reported to me various tasks, I knew which task that wasn't getting done because the person I assigned it to suddenly wasn't answering my telephone calls. Right? They didn't know how to do it, and they were afraid to tell me that, and they were avoiding doing it. They did all the other things. What is it that we are avoiding in life? Are we willing to face and work on the toughest things that we have to do? Now this is me again at the end of the Arrêt du Cosmique, and at that place, that really is as steep as that looks. All right, it's funny if in the other direction there is a cable car station, like me, and I could go get a hot dog about 5 minutes after this, but that valley floor down there is about 7,000 feet below where I am there. Now you might say, if you have an experience like maybe the best friend that I've ever had who was a roofer, he said, don't worry about anything over 30 feet. The first 30 feet will kill you. So, but how do you make yourself able to do this? And the answer is that you trust the rope. Right? Well, one of the things that I learned in the first time that I took a little course in mountain climbing, they intentionally teach you this. They dangled me over the side of a mountain, right, where I'm just there in midair, and you have to learn to trust the rope that somebody's going to catch you. Christians don't have to live in constant fear. God is, I think I've known people who felt like they went through life like they were going through a minefield, that if they made one mistake, boom, God would send them to hell. God loves you. Right? Paul says that he who, while we were yet sinners, right, did not spare to give his own son, how shall he not freely now give us all things? Right? Trust his grace. Don't be so afraid of failure. Now, this is the Aiguille d'Entrève, which is another rock climbing venue, maybe 3 or 4 miles from the Arête du Cosmique, over on almost exactly the French-Italian border. And it's every bit as scary as it looks, right? Aiguille is French for needle. I've climbed about half a dozen needles in that area, and let me tell you, anything named needle something is, you watch out. And I'm taking this photo from a little ledge. I'm like this, taking it, and to get from where they are to where I am, you have to step over the void. I don't know whether you remember Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, right? That business is, okay, it's that kind of move. And once again, a point that might be made here is that you end up being able to do more than you originally imagined you could do. That picture is taken maybe 4 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was a young man, right? It would have scared me to death. You have to learn that God can do exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask or think. That's his normal way of operating. You give him your life, he'll do more with it than you ever thought possible. Now, this is a picture of the Grand Couloir on the Goutte Ridge, which is the standard route to climb Mont Blanc. And the Grand Couloir is encouragingly nicknamed by the French the Couloir du Mort, that is, the Gully of Death. You can see how long that little stretch of trail is on the ledge, and 40 yards, 50 yards. It is the single deadliest spot in the Alps. On average, about 3 people a year die in those 50 yards. And the reason why we were climbing the Aiguille d'Entrève was that we couldn't climb Mont Blanc. And why couldn't we climb Mont Blanc? It's because we had tried, and 2 days earlier, about 3 o'clock in the morning, as I was still on the rock, just barely on the rock, and my guide stepped out on the ledge, and rock came hurtling down that couloir and struck him. And broke his arm, cut his wrist badly so that it had to have separate surgery, injured his right leg to the point where he lost all feeling or use of that leg. Now, he recovered. And my only point is that at some point you have to overcome your fear. Right? Are there real dangers in life? Yes, there are. That Satan goes around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. You can't mountain climb. Or at least you shouldn't, unless you can face the reality that there's such a thing as objective hazard. That's what a mountaineer calls it. That is things that no amount of physical training can make go away. But there has to be a mental training for yourself that you're not going to allow it to paralyze you. Well, that is my picture, and I'm proud of that picture of what used to be called Mount McKinley. Mountaineers call it Denali, which in the native language means something like the Great One. And boy, it's great. It's the highest peak in North America and one of the most difficult and dangerous mountains to climb in the world that people other than experts can climb. I mean, there are mountains like K2 that only a true expert could climb. But Denali can be climbed, but it's a real chore. Now, you land to climb Denali. You land on a little plain with skis on it on a glacier at 7,000 feet. And the first part of the climb of the mountain is to go across that glacier. And the problem with that glacier is that it's very active, which is a way of saying that giant cracks appear without warning in the ice. And the snow covers them so that you can't see them. And what this man is doing is using a probe, a long metal rod, to test and see if there is a crevasse there. We happened to be one of the last groups on the mountain in that year, this 2011. I was on top of Denali on July 7th, 2011, and the weather was too good. And we got stuck at Camp 1. We ran out of food, and we finally decided to go for it at 2 o'clock in the morning when the ice is as firm as it can be, and everybody travels together. One of the greatest mountain climbers in the world was about 50 feet from me. And you remember the old TV series Get Smart? Man, a lot of you will. Right, Max in the phone booth? Well, Greg Vernevage, that's his name, is standing there, and he says very quietly, "Uh-oh." And whoosh, right, down he goes. Of the 17 people who were traveling together, 7 of us fell in those crevasses. No one died, no one was injured, because the rest of the team followed. All right. Now, I don't know whether this picture really conveys adequately the situation, but this is the mountain wall between camps 2 and 3, and it is, I'm told, the longest fixed rope in the world. That is, why do you put in a fixed rope? If you know anything about climbing, you would know that they are a pain in the neck. Why do you put in a fixed rope? Because you'd rather not die. Right? You want to be clipped to that rope in case you fall. You won't fall all the way. 1,200 feet of fixed rope. Now, what does that have to do with self-control? You see, when you're in that situation, we've stopped to sort of prepare ourselves physically and mentally for it. And by the way, one of the things that makes climbing Denali so difficult is because it's a tremendous cardiovascular demand. It's all on ice. It takes about 3 weeks to go up and down, and so you have to take all your gear and food to last 3 weeks. 100 pounds. And I don't know, I was nearly 60. I was 6 weeks before my 60th birthday. Carrying 100 pounds, it's a little tough. But you need to be so prepared that you can focus on what you're doing instead of worrying about being overtired. But your mind needs to be clear. When I work out at the gym for years, I've been thrown out of gyms for sweating too much. Right? That's not a joke. And I always look like I'm going to die. And once I was working out with a young friend of mine, and a woman a very attractive woman came up to us and said to him, I dreamed of you last night. So she walks away, and he and I look at each other. And so I go home, and I tell my wife this story. And she's a wife, so of course she asked the natural question, do strange women talk to you at the gym? And of course I had to be honest. And so I said, yes, they do all the time. They always say the same thing. They say, are you okay? Now, I look like I'm going to die at the gym, so I won't die on the mountain. This is high camp on Denali, and you might notice that conditions are pretty severe. Why is Denali? I mean, most mountaineers will say, no contest, that climbing Denali is considerably more difficult than climbing Everest. There's far more technical climbing involved in it, and just the cardiovascular demand is greater. And the weather is just as bad or worse because you're so far north. There are things that are outside our control in life. And, when we were at that camp, I had lots of time to take that picture because we spent 3 days at high camp. The first 2 days, we didn't try to reach the summit because the wind was about 100 miles an hour. Right? There are things that we can't control in life. And we have to take them in stride and keep on with our lives. Now, I don't mean in any sense to diminish the genuine tragedy that has occurred in this country from people in this epidemic. I got the coronavirus myself this past July, and I was far sicker than any sick dog I ever saw. I had 9 straight days where my temperature didn't fall for a single minute in those 9 days below about 101 and a half. It's a serious thing. But at some point, we have to keep on living. We must not let the stresses of our life cause us to retreat. In Tennessee, certainly when I was growing up, the snow comes down and it's a school day and people stop. In Vermont, I lived 5 years on the Vermont-New Hampshire border. You know what they do in Vermont when it snows, right? They do the same thing that they do when it doesn't snow, right? Because if they didn't react that way, they'd be giving up their life. Christians have to learn to trust God in all situations. And I may say about that when I was sick, I was very worried the first day or so because my wife and our youngest daughter are in high-risk groups, and I was concerned about them. And then I discovered after the first day that I wasn't worried. Why not? 30 years ago, I guess, more than that, maybe. No, about 30 years ago. I'm old enough so that I lose count. 40 years ago, I was assigned by someone a fine preacher that you may know, David Farr, to look at the book of Philippians and at various translations of it and talk to people about the translation decisions that were made by the various translators of Philippians. And if you look at Philippians closely, you discover that there's a little bit of a problem. And that is that Paul keeps saying in one place, I don't know how this is going to come out. I'm in prison, right? And back in those days, they didn't put you in prison for a term, right? You were in prison because they were thinking about killing you. He says, I don't know how this is going to come out. And then in another place, he says, I'm sure that I'm going to come out all right. Well, what does he mean? He means this. He means he doesn't know whether or not he's going to be released from prison or executed, but he knows he's going to be okay with God. And now I'm glad. I wasn't glad at the time I was sick, but I'm glad I was sick now because I learned, right, for myself, that at this point in my life, I know I'm going to be okay. I didn't know whether I was going to recover or not. But I knew that I was safe in God's love. And that my wife and child were. I was trusted his decisions. Now that's the summit ridge of Denali. And there is it's not evident here, but there are these little metal spikes driven along that ridge. And on the ridge that led from Camp 3 to Camp 4, called ice pickets. And there are more than 300 of them on those ridges at the time that I climbed Denali, and that's not normal. Why were they there? Well, it's because 2 rope teams, the ice was particularly hazardous that year, and 2 rope teams had been swept off that ridge to their death. But you put in security so that won't happen to you. I fell. I probably shouldn't admit it because it makes me look like a klutz mountain climber, but I fell on that ridge and broke my ribs, and I fell on that last dash across the glacier and broke my thumb. Denali, exacted a price from me, but I fell about 10 feet because I had other people holding me and because all of us were tied to something that would hold the team as a whole. Let me just say about that one last word, and I don't want to run over, but this business of becoming the best person you can be can sometimes metastasize. You know that we use that word in connection with cancer. What is cancer? Cancer is a cell that isn't acting like it should, that's out of control. And sometimes this idea of becoming the best person that you can be metastasizes into personal fulfillment rather than becoming the best person you can be for the sake of the people around you and for the glory of God. The real reason why we want to be the best people that God intended us to be is that we're a family. Right? We belong to each other. No person can succeed to himself or herself or fail to himself or herself. If you're a parent tonight and you feel deeply your own inadequacies, and you might say, I hope my children don't follow me. I've got bad news for you, they will. Right? It doesn't mean that our parents are our fates, but it does mean that not a single one of us can ever go through life successfully, selfishly. We affect other people. And part of true self-control is this intentional will to belong to others and to God. Now there's kind of proof that I got to the top. I am the guy buried in that big orange coat. All right, if you'll turn it off now. There's a poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled If. I would guess that that a number of you will recognize that poem. My mother, again, on this topic of influencing others. One of my earliest memories, and my earliest memories of my mother doing two things. Reading Bible stories to me and reading poetry to me. She had a little book, 101 best-loved poems of the American people. And her taste in poetry was awful, I must admit, right? She loved this really schmaltzy poetry. She graduated in college. She was quite old when I was born. She graduated from college in 1927, and she liked the kind of poetry that women graduates of college in 1927 liked. But one of the poems in that book is If, and it's Kipling talking to his son. And he says, I really like the opening lines. He says, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. But he goes through several other ifs, and he concludes with this. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, then yours is the world and all that's in it. And what's more, you'll be a man, my son. Now I want you to think about how true that's not a Christian poem. You won't find God in it. And there are certain things that Revelation didn't need to tell us for us to recognize that are true. That is that wasting life is foolish. But if you think about that last stanza of that poem, think about how true it is to the teaching of Jesus. You realize that we will give an account of every idle word that we shall speak. As somebody who has spoken a whole bunch of words, I've thought about that one. And the word translated idle there in Greek means not working. Every day of my life needs to be working toward what I want my life to mean. I think that would be true even if I weren't a Christian. But as a Christian, as somebody who believes that the stakes are so high that human beings are eternal and designed by their Creator to live forever with Him, how can I live any day of my life except for Him? What part of my life was not purchased on the cross? Which moment in my life belongs to me only and not God? I think the answer to that question is obvious, that if Jesus is Lord at all, He's Lord of all. As we close tonight, I would ask you to think about your own life. And maybe the right place to start, if you want to get better control of your life, I suggest this to my students. Hey, start by just keeping a record of what you're doing. You want to read more Bible? Keep a record every day of how much Bible you read. I'll guarantee you'll read more Bible if you keep a record, because you won't want to face the empty pages. Right. Think about in your life what it is that needs to come under your control so that it can be given to God. If there's anyone present whose life hasn't been given to God, right? The rest of this lesson is about what to do once you make the decision that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that He died for your sins, and that you need to live for him and for your fellow human beings. But if you haven't made that decision and realize that you should, I don't believe in soft selling the gospel in any way. Right? This idea that Christianity is asking you to come forward and be baptized, and that's it, and maybe you'll show up regularly at church, and so you'll be a faithful Christian. No. What does God want from you? He wants it all. And if you haven't given him yourself and are ready to do so tonight, I'd encourage you to come.